Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we're going to be looking at the writing part of the book Feminist Revolution. It was published 1975 by Redstockings, and it's going to be discussed by me, Jo Brew, and Marian Rutigliano. Um, so just to say, this is a women-only webinar, so if you are a man, please leave and watch it later, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I'll introduce the very first bit, and then we can go over to Marian. So this Feminist Revolution, it's a book of a lot of different writings by the Redstockings group who were in New York. And the starting of it says, "Sisterhood is powerful, consciousness raising, women of the world unite, the Miss America protest, the pro-woman line, the politics of housework, the personal is political." And then saying, brandishing these slogans, radicals of the women's liberation movement awakened mass feminist consciousness. Now, summing up their experience and that of the movement as a whole, they prepare for the new offensive. And the reason I really value this book is that this was sort of peak revolutionary zeal, as far as I can see. They were really confident and ambitious in what they were aiming to achieve. And it's just I suppose it's delightful and it's encouraging, and it's also there's a lot that I've learned from reading different bits of it. How about you, Marian? Why do you like it?
I like it because it's a collection. Books from start to finish by one woman are great to read, but I like this because it's a collection. And it was like it was written at the time it was happening. I mean, the very first essay, she talks about here's what you have to do. And it was simple things like write it down, keep a record of who said what and who did what, because you're going to want to know that later on. So it was like as it was happening, it was people writing down, this is what we said, this is what we did, these were our ideas. And then 2 essays later, we used to think this in the first essay, and we still think part of that, but then we found out that now this is true, and it's not quite what we thought. So it's like living history.
Yeah.
And I was there for some of it. I was very, very young, but I was there and kind of remembered,
Which bits of it were you there? Because it says it was published 1975. Were you when were you around?
I was out in 1969 down in the village in New York. So I was around, and I was like a little puppy following these women around, or a fly on the wall, and sneaking in places if I could get in there to like just listen. So I mean, I was like it was like a little baby sponge.
Wow. And was the atmosphere amazing?
It was really amazing. It was just, I mean, it happened very suddenly. The women's movement happened really pretty suddenly in the mid 60s, but by the late 60s into the early 70s, there was this lesbian community in this one like location. And it was all over the place. I mean, there were bars and bookstores and stuff like that, but women lived down there. I mean, you'd see the same people all the time, and there were businesses, and you'd try to patronize those businesses. It was a coherent lesbian community existing, oddly enough, side by side with a very coherent gay male community in the same geographic area. And they were very different. I mean, they were very different in how and how they lived.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about the book, but what was this going on in the whole of the States, or was it really concentrated in New York?
New York and San Francisco. I mean, I wasn't in San Francisco, and there was similar stuff going on there, but this was just, in New York, and specifically Manhattan, in the Village. And then later on, lesbian community. People don't realize there were lesbian communities up and down the states. Eventually, Northampton, Massachusetts, became the very bosom of lesbiana, as it were. It is no longer. It's been taken over and queerified and transified and all that. Boone, North Carolina, I mean, people just like, what, Boone? Yeah, Boone, North Carolina eventually had this, and that was a little later in the 80s, had this, lesbian community. And there were like little pockets of that. But the village was just, I mean, there was a community. I mean, there are women that I know now where it's like, you remember such and such a bar? Yeah, I used to go there all the time. Yeah, when we probably met and talked to each other.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well let's go back to the book. And here we are. So we'll go to the first part. Now, um, this first bit is in the section which is, I think, chapter 4 or 5, so it's near, sort of quite well into it. And it's consciousness raising, a radical weapon. And the reason I like it or wanted to focus on this is that um, they this to me seems to be one of the areas of the book where they're really revolutionary. They really want to change things, and they're trying to work out what how we can make the world a different place. Like, we've sort of had these insights, or we're getting these insights, and what are our tools, what are our methods to change? And they see consciousness raising as a radical weapon. So it's not just a way of becoming aware, it's actually a tool to overthrow patriarchy. So I'll read a bit of it. So it says, so it's by Kathy Sarah Child, or a Sarah Child. The idea to be able to understand what feminist consciousness raising is all about, it's important to remember that it began as a program among women who all considered themselves radical. Before we go any further, let's examine the word radical. It's a word that is often used to suggest extremist, but actually it doesn't mean that. The dictionary says radical means root, coming from the Latin word for root. And that is what we meant by calling ourselves radicals. We were interested in getting to the roots of the problems in society. You might say we wanted to pull up weeds in the garden by their roots, not just pick off the leaves at the top to make things look good momentarily. Women's liberation was started by women who considered themselves radicals in this sense. So I think that's useful to know. And it's interesting, this sentence say that this is what we meant by calling ourselves radicals. So it could be that she is describing the beginning of them, of when women started calling themselves radical feminists. What do you think, Marian?
Radical and root is, I'm kind of a math nerd. When you in math, that little sign for the long division, that little check mark that looks like a sign, that's called the radical. And in mathematics, you use the radical to get to the root. And that's where they got it from. It's not like extremist. That's not what it means, what she said. What it means is radical feminism is used to get to the root of what the problem is. We look at life. Why is life the way it is for us? And the radical analysis is getting to the root of why it's like that.
And this group, do you think, the Redstockings, sort of in New York, this joining together and meeting of women, they were the first women to call themselves radical feminists?
Yes, as far as I know. I mean, there may have been others, and it may have been, somebody 2 weeks later. So in retrospect, they weren't the first if it happened within a very short time. But that was the first time I ever heard of it, was there. Just FYI, somebody asked if the book is still available. You can get it used in various locations.
Yeah. I find that quite often on eBay, it's quite a good place to get things that, well, there's a range of places, but eBay often has cheaper versions of things. Okay, let's go to the next one. Are you okay to read the next one?
Sure. Um, in the end, the group decided to raise its consciousness by studying women's lives by topics like childhood, jobs, motherhood, etc. We'd do any outside reading we wanted to and thought was important, but our starting point for discussion, as well as our test of the accuracy of what any of the books said, would be the actual experience we had in those areas. One of the questions suggested by Anne Forer we would bring at all times to our studies would be, who and what has an interest in maintaining the oppression in our lives? The kind of actions the group should engage in. At this point, we decided, acting on an idea of Carol Hanisch, another woman in the group, would be consciousness-raising actions. Actions brought to the public for the specific purpose of challenging old ideas and raising new ones. The very same issues of feminism we were studying ourselves. Our role was not to be a service organization, we decided, nor a large membership organization. What we were talking about being was, in effect, Carol explained, a ZAP action, political agitation and education group, something like what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had been. Unless you're an American boomer, you don't know what that was. We would be the first to dare to say and do the undareable, what women really felt and wanted. The first job now was to raise awareness and understanding, our own and others' awareness, and that would prompt people to organize and to act on a mass scale. And she mentions, Carol mentions Ann Forer. In the book, the chapter right after this chapter on consciousness raising is by Ann Forer. And she said, we decided to talk about what we felt, what we experienced. For example, no woman seems to feel that she really looks good just the way she is. She doesn't look quite right. Something is missing to make the total picture what it should be. Okay, this is step one. We now have a clear picture of the present state of women's consciousness on how she thinks of herself now. We all think we don't look really good as we happen to be at this minute. And I know some people may say, I've never felt that way. What consciousness raising found out, one of the things they found out was that most women felt that way about almost any topic that came up. But she says, this is an important piece of information, and it's political information. As long as each woman thought that we alone, that she was alone in feeling dissatisfied about her looks, for example, it's an individual problem. As soon as we discover that it affects women as a group, it becomes political. We are dealing with a class of people in society who are all suffering from a feeling of inadequacy. If they were different in some way, they would be more adequate, but they didn't quite make it. So we, when we recognize that we are suffering, not all alone, but instead it's a class problem and all women suffer from it, it tends to lift the problem off your shoulders. It's no longer personal. We can look around to see who should shoulder the responsibility for this cruel thing that was done to us. We discover that it's political, not personal. There's more to conscious raising than that, and Kathy Sarachild will get into it. But that was one woman's experience of it. And I think that was a really wonderful description of what it is and what it does.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. And so there's loads in the book that's worth reading. And in the chat, we've had a very useful post saying the website is a treasure trove, and it's www.redstockings.org, and there are loads of PDFs there. So if you when you get on the website, you'll get to the ability, and you'll be able to read the whole of this book and also additional material in that book. So that's really good. And then linked to that in the chat, we've got Sheila Jeffries has said that she's going to have a new book out, which is a collection of her speeches from the last 4 or 5 years. And it's going to be called Uprooting Male Domination, which is really, really relevant because of the radical Radis. Following on that. So that's really something we're going to be looking forward to, that this new book is coming out, Uprooting Male Domination. Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide. So here. Right, so I'll do this one. So the decision to emphasize our own feelings, this is Kathy Sarachild again, and experiences as women, and to test all generalizations and reading we did by our own experience was actually the scientific method of research. We were, in effect, repeating the 17th century challenge of science to scholasticism, study nature, not books, and put all theories to the test of living practice and action. It was also a method of radical organizing tested by other revolutions. We're applying to women and to ourselves as women liberation organisers the practice a number of us had learnt as organisers in the civil rights movement in the South in the early 1960s. Consciousness raising, studying the whole gamut of women's lives, started with the full reality of one's own, would also be a way of keeping the movement radical by preventing it from getting sidetracked into the single issue reforms and single issue organizing. It would be a way of carrying theory about women further than it has ever been carried before, as the groundwork for achieving a radical solution for women as yet attained nowhere. So it's lovely to just participate, to hear what they were thinking, and how yes, how ambitious they were, and how thoughtful they were as well. They were sort of trying to work out how to have our revolution and using different methods. So it was definitely going somewhere. It was going towards changing the world. Marian, shall I move on to the next slide so you can do it?
Yeah, move on to the next slide.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Talk about this one and then I'll move on to the next one.
I remember that.
Wow. Where was it? New York. So were you there?
I mean, I was around kind of like just watching. I remember a little fly on the wall, just like watching these women. One of the things though, it's the strike for equality. And you know, we talk now about what we really wanted was liberation, but equality was kind of interwoven with that back then. I mean, you couldn't, there's just things that you absolutely couldn't do as a woman. I mean, you couldn't. It was very very stark contrast about being unequal. And we realized that it was really more like liberation, wanting to be liberated from the structure that made us so unequal.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I like this Women of the World Unite because of the Marxist Workers of the World Unite, because I mean, particularly in Britain, many of us grew up on the left. I mean, I sort of was very much steeped in the left-wing ideas or sort of Marxist ideas of Workers of the World Unite. So sort of know all of those important phrases. And then I think that it's very nice seeing them, because they're sort of saying they're rooted in the liberation movements and going beyond them, and making it relevant to us rather than just men getting or focused on male liberation or male, yeah. But Women of the World Unite is lovely. Okay, let's go on to the next one.
The US never really had much of a socialist presence, but women uniting, Andrea Dworkin gave it a more distinctly feminist and woman-focused rendering. Feminism is a political practice of fighting male supremacy on behalf of all women as a class, including all the women you don't like, including all the women you don't want to be around, including all the women who used to be your best friends, whom you don't want anything to do with anymore. It doesn't matter who the individual women are. It was just a very feminist way of saying we are a class of people who are oppressed.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is for you, Marian.
The resistance is not futile. There turned out to be tremendous resistance to women simply studying their situation, especially without men in the room. In the beginning, we had set out to do our studying in order to take better action. We hadn't realized that just studying this subject and naming the problem and problems would be a radical action in itself. Action so radical as to engender tremendous and persistent opposition from directions that still managed to flabbergast me. The opposition often took the form of misinterpretation and misrepresentations of what we were doing, so that no amount of explanation on our part seemed able to set straight. The methods and assumptions behind consciousness raising essentially grew out of both the scientific and radical political traditions. But when we applied them to women's situation, a whole lot of otherwise scientific and radical people, especially men, just couldn't see this. And men were sort of indulgent for a while. This stuff that women were doing was just sort of a blip, and let the ladies just like chatter with each other. And when they started realizing it was more than just it wasn't just commiserating, it wasn't just bitching and whining, to use that terrible phrase. It wasn't just that. They started to object to it, and it was like, and they realized that women would come out of consciousness raising with a sense that gosh, every woman goes through this, and what can we do about it? And that has not changed. That has not changed. There was you know we see men making believe that they are women invading our spaces. And there was even a discussion on one of their websites, one of the websites for these men, about, well, maybe these women, they call us cis women, which means like real women, maybe they should have, like, give them a space here and there to talk about problems that just affect them. And one of the objections to that was that we might become anti-trans, or we might become anti-gender, or we might start having radical ideas, which is great. So that means we should do it more.
Yeah.
Next slide.
So I'll just put in another comment here while reading from the comments. Kathy Sarahchild spoke, this is from the comments, on the WDI USA YouTube. She spoke at a conference, or possibly on YouTube. But anyway, there is a of her speaking just very recently. So if you're interested in seeing that, go to WDI USA YouTube channel and look for her speech. So that will be really interesting. I haven't watched that, so I'm going to watch that. And the other thing that, just while I'm mentioning other things to watch, is I've been listening to Women's Liberation Radio News. They've got about 105 podcasts they've been doing monthly. They're about an hour long or something like that. And they're really good. So if you're not listening to them, I would really highly recommend listening to them. And they come out every month. You'll find them. It's called either WLRN or Women's Liberation Radio News. Is definitely a nice thing to be listening to, and it's just sort of quite better than Radio 4 if you're in Britain. So, which is very, very upsetting, because they always like slip in this dodgy revisionism and pro-trans stuff, whereas Women's Liberation Radio News is totally no problem. Okay, let's move on to another slide. So I'll do this slide. So whole areas of women's lives were declared off limits to discussion. The topics we were talking about in our groups were dismissed as petty or not political. Often these were the key areas in terms of how women are oppressed as a particular group, like housework, childcare, and sex. Everybody, from Republicans to communists, said that they agreed that equal pay for equal work was a valid issue and deserved support. But when women wanted to try to figure out why we weren't getting equal pay for equal work anywhere, and wanted to take a look at these areas, then what we were doing wasn't politics, economics, or even study at all, but therapy, something that women had to work out for themselves individually. When we began analysing these problems in terms of male chauvinism, we were suddenly the living proof of how backward women are. Although we had taken radical political action and risks many times before, and would act again and again when we discussed male chauvinism, suddenly we were just women who complained all the time, who stayed in the personal realm and never took any action. And I mean, I've definitely experienced that all my life with when there are men around, they'll be all for equality for women, but when you actually talk to them about the nitty-gritty, or when we try in groups to talk to getting things done, they turn in a very hostile way on you. Like I years and years ago, I was in the National Union of Journalists, the NUJ, and I suggested to the NUJ that they have they implement their equality policy by having half of the articles in their magazine written by women and or about women's issues, but or making sure certainly that there would be women in the leadership and speaking on behalf of the NUJ, and they just went ballistic. They were so livid about that. The idea that women would actually have some form of equality was you know, if you they're happy to say it, but then to actually do it challenges, I suppose, their positions, which it really did. Okay, shall I do go to the next one for you, Marian?
Yeah, no, you can read the next one. It is on the it's part of the previous slide.
Okay, and when we attempted to describe the realities of our lives in certain ways, however logical, for instance, when we said that men oppressed women, or that all men were among the beneficiaries in the oppression of women, some people got really upset. You can't say that men are oppressors of women. Men are oppressed too, and women discriminate against women. So now it would seem to go without saying that if women have a secondary status in society compared to men and are treated as secondary creatures, then the beneficiaries would be those with primary status. I mean, this is it's so pertinent today. I suppose it's the same. It goes on and on and on, doesn't it? People say, "Oh, men are oppressed too." You can't be so simplistic to say that they are oppressing women as a sex class. It seems to be the go-to answer if we criticize patriarchy or men.
Um, there there was a previous Rad Fem Perspectives about consciousness raising. It's in our archives, and it was extremely well done by somebody who used to do, lead consciousness raising groups. Somebody asked where did this happen? It was, if there was a women's center, a women's bookstore, a cafe or something, and somebody who, knew the techniques, because there are rules to it. There was a way to do it. It's not group therapy. It's not sitting around complaining. You select a topic, every woman talks one at a time. You speak personally and very specifically and from your own experience. You don't interrupt someone else. You don't challenge anyone else's experience. You try not to give advice. And then the group finds a common element, what conclusion can be drawn. This is very, very important. So it's not just a whining session at all. It's very, very specific. It's very directed. And the part at the end where you find the common element, the common to us as a class of people is really very, very important. We can go on to the next slide, I guess.
Yeah, I just sort of add that when I talk to young women, particularly today, there's all this stuff about well-being and how they're meant to be able to express themselves and talk about how to make their lives better, but the options given to them are very, very much individual actions.
Yeah.
And I what I'll tell you an example I did. That my daughter was when she was in year six at primary school. You have to choose what lunch you want, and she would choose ice cream when ice cream came up, and you get a green band to say you're getting ice cream. She said to me, "Look, there's just when we get there, because we go in last, there's never ice cream, so we always get this sort of dry, horrible biscuit, and it seems really wrong that they're offering us an ice cream, but we never get it. Shall I complain?" And I said, yeah, you could complain as an individual, but why don't you do a class action? And so I was sort of making the analogy with her class and get all 30 of you in your class to sign a petition in writing and email it. I'll email it as well, and send it to your head teacher as a class action. And she did it, and they got it changed immediately the next day, but as a class action. But I think there's not just the insight that it's good to work as a class, we can get more done, but also it's really nice working as a class. It's much better working together, like us doing this radical feminist perspectives. It's wonderful being together. So I think there's a lot of different reasons why working as a class to sort of make things better for women is better than just working as an individual. And yeah, anyway, so okay, let's go on to the next one. So let's see what Marian, what can you say about this?
Well, I wasn't there for
Image.
that.
Sorry?
No, I was not there for that. Um, and I don't, I, my French is limited to like bonjour, so I'm not sure exactly what this says.
It's saying les femmes descendent dans la rue, which is the women descend or go down into the road. Women take to the streets, as it says in the bottom. But international demonstration for abortion law repeal and freedom for women,
Okay,
1971. So things were happening in France.
okay.
It looks quite similar, actually. It looks like they're
Yeah, it
very,
actually does. I was thinking it's like this could be anywhere.
yeah. And
And
yeah, it definitely looks the sort of similar sort of demo. Right, so let's go to the next bit and over to you, Mary.
the program. There was no denying, though, that we ourselves were learning a tremendous amount from the discussions and were finding them very exciting. From our consciousness-raising meetings was coming the writing, which was formulating basic theory for the women's liberation movement. So the consciousness-raising groups were not reading writings; they were inspiring writings. Shulamith Firestone, who wrote the book The Dialectic of Sex, Ann Cote, who wrote the essay The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm, Pat Minority, who wrote the essay The Politics of Housework, Carol Hanisch, who wrote the essay The Personal is Political, Kate Millett, who wrote Sexual Politics, Cindy Sisler, who led the groundbreaking abortion law repeal fight in New York, Rosalind Baxendall, Irene Pesklikis, I always mispronounce her name, and I apologize, Irene. Ellen Willis, Robin Morgan, and many others participated in these discussions. Most of us had thought that we were already radicals, but we were discovering that we were only beginning to have a radical understanding of women and of other issues of class, race, and revolutionary change. Remember, radical, we get to the root. Our group was growing rapidly. Other women were as fascinated as we about the idea of doing something politically about aspects of our lives as women that we never thought could be dealt with politically, that we thought we would just have to work out as best we could alone. Most of those issues the National Organization for Women wouldn't touch. Was it because these subjects were petty or really hitting at the heart of things, areas of deepest humiliation for all women? Neither was now then organizing. They were not organizing consciousness raising groups. Went over into the next slide.
Sorry, I've lost my mouse.
Yeah, the National
There we are.
Organization for
Yeah.
Women was really dropped the ball on political action for women. They did some good things, but they really did drop the ball in a lot of ways. The organizing, consciousness raising, this only happened after 1968 when the new and more radical, getting to the root, groups formed with a mass perspective. Our group's first public action after putting out a journal was an attempt to reach the masses with our ideas on one of those so-called petty topics, the issue of appearance. We protested and picketed the Miss America contest, throwing high heels, girdles, and other objects of female torture into a freedom trash can. It was this action in 1968 which first awakened widespread awareness of the new women's liberation movement, capturing world interest and giving the movement its very name. Think about that. They did not start with throw out your high heels, throw out your beauty thing. I mean, that's not where it started. That was the result of the radical analysis getting to the root of things and saying, our appearance, our ability to move around, our ability to do certain job is compromised, is completely made impossible in many cases by all this other stuff. There's jobs you can't do when you're wearing high heels. There's reactions that men have when they're catcalling from construction sites that get worse when you're in high heels, all this stuff.
Yeah. And it's great that they took action. So I really like reading this, and finding out what they were doing, that they were doing consciousness raising. I mean, it's amazing the names, those women who many of them wrote incredibly important texts, that they were coming together, thinking together, and then deciding to take action and do things that would change the world. And I guess I'm just obsessed with that, sort of interested. Like it's all very well us knowing all this, but how are we going to actually implement it? And it's really important that we do, because of things being so bad in the world. And I sort of really believe that we need to. So I sort of keep looking around to see, what did they do, what was their plan, um, and we know. I mean, everybody remembers this. This is part of culture, knowing that feminists went and disrupted the Miss America contest. Um, they I suppose it's the bra burning, isn't it? But they're saying throwing high heels, girdles, and other objects of female torture into a freedom trash can is fantastic. Okay, so let's go to the next one. I think this is a picture of them. Yeah, so it's reasonably small on the screen, but uh, here from Sisterhood is Powerful. So they got this picture of the action, and then it's saying Atlantic City, 1968, the first mass demonstration action by women's liberation. Top, picketing and guerrilla theatre on the boardwalk, and then above, disruption of the live telecast of the Miss America pageant. So good for them. And then they've got little badges, which it's a really nice 1970. So Uppity Women Unite, and that nice Radfem logo. Feminism lives, freedom for women. Can't read the one on the top right, but then Sisterhood is Powerful. So all these lovely slogans that were knocking around at the time. Okay, let's go to the next one. Shall I do that? I'll do this one, Marian, and
Sure.
then.
Yeah, do
So
the
our
next
study
one.
groups were radicalizing our own consciousness, and it suddenly became apparent that women could be doing on a mass scale what we were doing in our own group. That the next logical radical action would be to get the word out about what we were doing. This kind of study would be part of what was necessary to achieve the liberation of women on a mass scale. The pattern of obstacles to consciousness raising was also getting quite clear. And so I outlined, this is Kathy Serrachild, a paper talking about this, about how very political these so-called bitch sessions would be, suggesting what important information for our fight we still had to get from studying the experiences and feelings of women, describing some of the obstacles, and proposing that women everywhere begin. So yeah, that's very clear how they thought it out, that it was actual people thinking about doing it and then spreading those ideas.
Why don't you go on ahead and do the next slide too, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I just want to add is that my dream would be that we managed to get all the nail bars, certainly in Britain, but I guess they're everywhere. I think there are nail bars over the whole world. And if we could transform them all to consciousness raising groups, and because women meet together every week, at least every week, in these nail bars and get their nails done. And if they just stopped doing the nails and did consciousness raising, so we could just alter all of those, that would be a really great thing. But or otherwise, maybe just set up CR groups. Okay, let's go to the next one. Right, over to you, Marian.
Oh, okay. In an apartment on the Lower East Side, which at the time was a fairly unsavory place to be in terms it was dangerous and kind of broken down apartments. Redstockings, a group which takes its name from blue stockings, which was a term used in the past for intellectual women, met each Sunday. A poster on the wall reads, "Speak pains to recall pains." The Chinese Revolution. Tell it like it is. the Black Revolution, Bitch Sisters Bitch, the Final Revolution. I know a lot of women don't like that word, and I don't like it either, but it was actually used not uncommonly back then. The group employs consciousness raising, or the bitch session, which it really wasn't, to gain political insights from shared feelings. More than 30 young women sit crowded on the floor of the small, stuffy room for 5 to 6 hours. A question is posed, such as, did you choose to stay single or marry? Did you choose it? Each girl relates specific incidents in her life, and at the end, the testimony is analyzed. They find that problems they thought were their own private sorrows are shared by everyone in the group. If all women share the same problem, how can it be personal? Women's pain is not personal, it's political. And there's a photograph of them doing that. I don't recognize that room. One of the things is that is women talking among themselves. This is something that men can't stand, and we talked about it before, which tells me that we should be doing that more and more, even if it's not consciousness raising, even if it's women just getting together to go out for ice cream, even if it's women just getting together to go play softball like we used to. Whatever we do, doing it privately, where it's just women, specific things, where it's just women, whether it's consciousness raising or anything else, do it with other women, be places with other women, even if it's small groups here and there, but all over the place. Because those small private gatherings of just women start a snowball effect. And one woman from one little private group meets two women from another little private group, and so on and so on and so on. And we all realize it's not just me, it's all of us. That's a political thing, and it's hugely important.
And absolutely. And then if you look at what's happening in Afghanistan, where the Taliban have outlawed women speaking in public or speaking in their own homes, where a man who's not a family member might hear them. And then now they've changed the building regulations so that women can't see out of their houses and women can't be seen. It's just that there is a male consciousness. They know that women talking simply, as you say, just simply talking to one another is a threat to male supremacy. It's and the fact that they actually are implementing it, it's not just they know, they want it. They want to stop us talking. It's just
Yeah.
vile. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Um,
Go ahead.
okay, so shall I do this one?
Sure.
6 years later, since 1967, consciousness raising has become one of the prime educational organizing programs of the women's liberation movement. Feminist groups and individual women who at first didn't think they needed it are all doing it. As consciousness raising became popular, many other groups and individuals became involved in it, and its nature has been changed to suit various purposes. The term consciousness raising has become widely used in contradictory contexts. A recent New York Times article referred to it. Even the women's liberation movement, there are all kinds of proponents of consciousness raising, people who are looked upon as experts in the field, and people who are drawing up all kinds of guidelines and rules for its use. In all of this, the original purpose of consciousness raising, its connection with revolutionary change for women, is all too often getting lost. This is why a look at the origins of consciousness raising provides such an important perspective. The purpose of women's liberation was to defeat male supremacy and give women equality. We felt that this was such a monumental task, how to approach it. Consciousness raising seemed to be what was needed. So this was 6 years later. So the first bit was the writing about what they were doing. And then 6 years later, it had become mainstream in a way, and lots of people were doing it, but it became less revolutionary and already, so very, very quickly. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn, that when we develop techniques and tools that could liberate women, it seems like repeatedly they are used or twisted or turned back on us. And there's a sort of inventiveness amongst in the patriarchy or in institutions in capitalism. Like say maybe the nail bars are a place that women, so people in the chat are saying it's a place women can talk to each other. So they're giving women part of what we want, which is a place where we can meet other women and talk often, but it's completely counter-revolutionary in many, many ways. Um, to be meeting like that, we really need to get back to the original form of like a good form of consciousness raising. Okay, I'll show the next slide and see what you think about that, Marian.
Yeah, women's strike frequently. Every time I see these old photos, I always like look at every face with a magnifying glass as like it's somebody there that I remember, recognize, or knew or know. And over years, it's like almost never. But I mean, it doesn't matter. I do know them. I mean, we all know every woman in there who was marching for that. And if we sat in a consciousness raising group with her, there would be a commonality. And that's what I think of when I see these photos.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. It's a women's strike for equality, and it looks like basically it's pretty much only women. And then you could just see, I'd see in the top left, there's some guy there. So probably these days he'd be wearing a skirt and got like a wig or something to make out that he was a woman. But the fact that there was a lot of women only organizing at the time is good. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, are you okay to do this one? Can you do this slide?
Sure. The male supremacist establishment, with a capital E, it was the establishment, and its forces of discrimination against women that consciousness raising set out to critique have rolled with the punch. Now the opposition to consciousness raising frequently comes under the guise of support or partial support. The establishment is trying to change consciousness raising, weaken, dilute, and take away its strength so it won't cause any more changes. Going to the sources, the historic roots, to the work that set the program in motion is one of the ways to fight this process. The wellspring of consciousness raising's power is the commitment to a radical approach, a radical solution. Under radical analysis, we get to the root, and that's the solution we want. What is the root of the problem? What is the root of the issue that's going on? What actually went on in the original consciousness raising program, which turned out to be so provocative, the thinking behind it, the literature which the original group produced, formed the kernel experience from which all other lessons grew. From it, we can also discover what may have been wrong in the original thinking that allowed some organizing to go off the track. But any corrections in the original idea must be done to make the weapon of consciousness raising in the hands of women sharper, not duller. And she's kind of very loosely, I think, alluding to that there were issues sometimes. Believe me, it was not, most consciousness raising was really done according to the way it was supposed to be done. But then, there would be groups of women, maybe not in the consciousness raising group, doing things that prompted what Andrea Dworkin said. Women who you disagree with, women who you have a lot of problems with, that you fight with. At the last WDI conference last September, I was talking about, I forget what I was talking about, but some one woman asked, well, what about in all these groups? I mean, wasn't there like infighting? What was the problem? Was there, were the leaders like ever just power hungry? Couldn't have been. And I was like, well, yeah, that did happen sometimes. And so, it comes down to a question of integrity, and it comes down to the root, which is our mission, and our mission is women. And what I like to say is, my mission is women, and they are my people, and we don't leave our people behind. And I think as long as we're mission focused and we don't leave any women behind out of doing this process the way it is most helpful, then we'll be okay.
Yeah, great. So next slide, I'll read that one. So checking out the original sources. The people who started consciousness raising did not see themselves as beginners in politics, including in many cases in feminism. Yet they intended consciousness raising as much for themselves as people who really were beginners. Consciousness raising was seen as both a method for arriving at the truth and a means for action and organising. It was a means for the organisers themselves to make an analysis of the situation, and also a means to be used by the people they were organising and who were in turn organising more people. Similarly, it wasn't seen as merely a stage in feminist development, which would then lead to another phase, an action phase, but an essential part of the overall feminist strategy. To get consciousness raising started, we as organisers gave it priority in our actions and outreach political work. In that sense, we saw it as a first stage to awaken people, to get people thinking and acting, but we also saw it as an ongoing and continuing source of theory and of ideas for action. We made the assumption, an assumption basic to, let's go on. Ah, okay, that's annoying. That we haven't got that. So basically they're saying, which is very, very interesting, that by hearing women's voices and by talking, they would get more clarity about what's happening, and they would be more accurate about understanding women's oppression. So the aim wasn't just a sort of therapeutic, feel good, let's all talk about it and bond together in sisterhood and have empathy for each other. It was, let's use this to inform our theory and our action. So it was a sort of very good dual purpose system where this things that we saw it as an ongoing and continuing source of theory and ideas for action. And then I'll move on to the next one.
Why don't you go on ahead with that one? We're coming up to 10 minutes left, so go on ahead.
Yeah. So the next one says, radical principles bring results. For instance, the aim of going around the room in a meeting to hear women's testimony, a common and exciting practice in consciousness raising, is to help stay focused on a point, to bring the discussion back to the main subject after exploring a tangent, to get the experience of as many people as possible in the common pool of knowledge. The purpose of hearing from everyone was never to be nice or tolerant or to develop speaking skills, she says, or the ability to listen. It was to get closer to the truth. Knowledge and information would make it possible for people to be able to speak. The purpose of hearing people's feelings and experience was not therapy. It was not to give someone a chance to get something off her chest. That is something for a friendship. It was to hear what she had to say. The importance of listening to a woman's feelings was collectively to analyse the situation of women, not to analyse her. The idea was not to change women, was not to make internal changes, except in the sense of knowing more. It was and is the conditions women face. It's male supremacy we want to change. So yeah, that's a really interesting point that they were very focused on why the consciousness raising groups were going. And I don't think when I came across them, that message really was clear. I think they just seemed to be sort of people chatting and being quite self-indulgent. I think, I mean, I probably heard about them in the mid-80s, and they didn't really seem to be very helpful at all to me, but it's very interesting where they came from.
There's a comment in the chat about, somebody's view of male bars and my view of this and my view. Consciousness raising is not about a woman's view of something else outside herself. Consciousness raising is about, this is what happened to me. This is what I experienced. You pick a topic like, I went to a nail bar and I felt this way. Not just, I think it's not a question of what you think is the purpose of a nail bar or anything else, a softball team, whatever, politically, but when I joined the softball team, I felt this way. This is what happened. This is what I experienced. And and then the next woman says, and this is how I felt about it. This is what I experienced. That's what consciousness raising is. It's not your opinions about something outside yourself. It's about, this is what happened to me, and this is how it made me feel. Not because it's important to focus on something individual, but because when every woman goes around the room, there's always a commonality, usually more than one, about how every woman felt about whatever the topic was selected. So we can move on to the next slide, I guess.
Yeah, so I've just had a quick look through ones that I think would be great to share. So there's this one, Japan, Mother's Day is Bullshit Parade, which is 1973, and that's good. So nice picture of women in the street. And then the one I wanted to go to now is this one by Ernestine Rose. So this is in the Blue Stocking, or the Redstockings book, but it's Ernestine Rose writing in 1860, A History of Women's Suffrage. And it's great that there's this linkage to our history. So she says, we have often been asked, what's the use of conventions? Why talk? Why not work? Just as if the thought did not precede the act. Those who act without previously thinking are not good for much. Thought is first required, and then the expression of it, and that leads to action. An action based on upon thought never needs to be reversed. It is lasting and profitable, and produces the desired effect. I know there are many who take advantage of this movement and then say, you are doing nothing, only talking. Yes, doing nothing. We have only broken up the ground and sowed the seeds. They are repaying the benefit, and yet they tell us we have done nothing. And I think it's really nice that that they've quoted and sort of talked about the insights that women, this Ernestine Rose in 1860 had about the importance of understanding and thinking and working out what choices we should make and what actions we should. It really is useful for us. And so yeah, that's a nice one. There's another, I think this one about personality attacks, character assassinations. Or no, let's maybe do the invisible treatment. That could be. Can I get you to read this one, Marian? Because we've only got a couple of minutes. This is
Yeah,
probably the last
invisible
one, the
treatment.
invisible
Yeah.
treatment.
Just as a quick reference, somebody said, do you give advice? Consciousness raising, here are the rules. There are rules. It works a certain way. A topic is selected. Every woman talks one at a time. You speak personally and specifically and from your own experience. You don't interrupt when it's another woman's turn. You don't ever challenge anyone else's experience, and you don't give advice. And then the common ground is found. And it needs to be somebody who's like taught how to do this. I mean, there are rules to it. The invisible treatment. As the liberals have obtained control of the women's liberation movement, their tactics have shifted. Rather than attacks, they now pretend that the pro-woman radical feminists and the politics we represent simply do not exist or do not exist anymore. We are not asked to speak or write for movement programs and journals and newspapers now controlled by the pseudo-left liberals, old school cancel culture. We are not listed in most bibliographies of movement papers and publications and speakers bureaus. Our work was dropped from the recommended list of the Women's History Library. A book representing the radical feminist journal Notes left out all the pro-woman line and consciousness-raising articles which had originally appeared in that journal. That they have attempted to bury us historically as well as shut us out from the present has become increasingly clear. And we were talking about this. It was like the women's liberation movement, consciousness raising, and all the really great stuff that happened. There was, this big thing, women's liberation in the mid-60s, but the late 70s through maybe the early 80s was, I call it Camelot, one brief shining moment. That was like a blip, and it was spectacular. It was wonderful, and it actually started to make political strides. And I think that was something that could not be tolerated by
Yeah.
Or
And
oppressors.
I really think it's the same techniques. I mean, I guess the maybe we should have a little list of the techniques the patriarchy and establishment use to shut out our ideas. But the invisible treatment is a really, really big one. And I think it's done, well, we know it's done by men and uh, and misogynists, and then it's done by the so-called, I mean, many parts of the revisionist women's movement who are sort of like itty bitty feminists, quoting Mary Daly. They're like little bit feminists, but they are very, very careful to invisibilize the radical feminists or pretend that we all died out in the 1980s and sort of say, oh, yes, there was radical feminism and it's now morphed into something else. Like, we're here. We're absolutely here. So I think us carrying on. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today.
And I encourage women to go back and find our previous radical feminist perspectives on consciousness raising, which goes into a lot more detail about this is what it is, this is how you do it.
Yeah, brilliant. And thank you so much also for the breakout rooms by Dorothea, who hosts them every week. It's just absolutely brilliant. So there are breakout rooms. You've got the links. So go to them, go along to them, and carry on the discussion if you've got the energy, which I'm going to go and do some gardening instead. Okay. Bye, Marian. It's lovely to see you and see you there in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. And see you next week. See everybody next week. Have a good
Bye.
week. Bye.